möchte Sie begrüßen zum heutigen Abend und mich noch einmal ausdrücklich beim Jewish Welcome Service bedanken, obwohl Frau Tauneck nicht hier ist, die einfach den gesamten Aufenthalt von der Frau Gottlieb aus New York ermöglicht hat. Freema Gottlieb, wie gesagt, lebt heute in New York. Sie ist aufgewachsen in Glasgow in Schottland. Ihre Eltern waren aus Wien. Sie mussten 1938 flüchten. Ihr Vater, über den sie eben dann sprechen wird, war Rabbiner Wolf Gottlieb, ein junger Rabbiner, ursprünglich aus Polen, der hier in Wien tätig war und einige Monate lang eine ganz wichtige religiöse Jugendalijahschule aufgebaut hat und geleitet hat mit ungefähr 600 Schülern, von denen die dann auch flüchten konnten. Und sie ist in Schottland aufgewachsen, sie hat dann Literaturwissenschaften studiert und viel publiziert in jüdischen Zeitschriften in England und dann auch ein Buch publiziert über das Licht in der jüdischen Tradition, über das sie morgen einen Lehrhausabend in der liberalen Gemeinde Ochadash geben wird. Seit einigen Jahren lebt sie in New York, sie schreibt auch über religiöse Themen. Sie war eine Zeit lang in Prag, hat über Prager Grabsteine und Prager Literatur geschrieben. Ihre Schwester lebt in Jerusalem, ist sehr bekannt. Aviva Zornberg-Gottlieb schreibt auch sehr viel über religiöse Literatur. Und ihre Mutter, Bracha oder Betty Rosen, ist aus einer sehr bekannten Familie. Ihr Onkel war der Oberrabbiner von Rumänien, Rabbi Rosen, und er war auch manchmal in Wien, er war auch ein ganz junger Mann, ein Student der rabbinischen Lehranstalt hier, und es gibt hier in seinen Erinnerungen ein sehr schönes Foto, man kann es vielleicht herumgehen lassen, von den Eltern und von der Familie mit dem jungen Rabbiner Gottlieb, und sie hat auch über ihn einen Artikel geschrieben und auch einen Artikel über ihren Vater, über den sie heute sprechen wird und über den sie recherchiert und über den sie hofft, noch mehr zu schreiben. Und sie wird in Englisch sprechen, aber es können Fragen dann auf Deutsch gefragt werden. Und was ich noch sagen wollte, wir wissen leider nicht allzu viel über seine Arbeit in Wien. Es gibt ein ganz wichtiges Zeugnis, das der Wiener Historiker Herbert Rosenkranz im Auftrag des Yad Vashem mit ihm aufgenommen hat, ein Interview, dessen Transkript wir haben, und das ist eines der wichtigsten Quellen für seine Arbeit in Wien. Bitte schön. Good evening.
I'm sorry that I have to speak in English, but I'll do my best. I mean, I hope you will understand. In the late 60s, when I was 21, I was standing by the curb of an empty road, looking out over the sands of Israel's Negev desert, with my hand held out. I was hoping to hitch a ride to Jerusalem. An army jeep stopped for me. The driver, somewhere in his early 40s, stripped to the waist in the scorching heat and bronzed like a true Middle Easterner, gave me the usual Israeli grilling as to who I was and where I was from. When he heard my name and that I was from Scotland, his whole face changed. He came out with these words: "Don't tell me your father is Rabbi Gottlieb. He saved my life. I came to this country on a special transport from Vienna, and his was the name on the certificate that got me out." He said that Eichmann's name was on the certificate too. It's like a legend, but I met this guy, and that's what he told me. And he didn't look at all like a Viennese. He looked like an Israeli or an Arab. He looked very Oriental. I was totally knocked over by what he said. To me, this was not a total revelation, however. My father never talked about it, but his work had become part of the family story I had grown up with. He had been an employee of the Jewish community, and part of his work after the Anschluss involved distributing in the best possible way the few exit visas that came his way. It may have seemed that selection of appropriate candidates was up to him. However, in his view, these certificates were not really his to give. since he had received them as a representative of the community. They belonged to Knesset Yisrael, that's to all the people of Israel as a whole. That is why my mother told us he did not release any of these papers to his own family. The closest he came to helping someone with whom he had personal ties was his Torah teacher. As certificates did not go per capita, but per family unit, he felt justified in doing so, because in helping his Rebbe, he was also helping to save the Rebbe's future children. In the course of that same trip in 1967 to Israel, I visited his family, the family of this Rebbe in Mea Shearim, a highly religious district of Jerusalem, and the number of the man's children and grandchildren had already grown to more than 90 at that time in 67. Just think of what he's got now. Right. At a time when the Nazis utilized mass immigration as a means to destroy the Viennese Jewish community, Rabbi Gottlieb and his colleagues of the Shamar Hadati youth movement used Aliyah as a way to restore the Jewish people to its own land. To return, however, to the 21-year-old hitching a ride with a handsome Israeli in the Negev during the 1960s. When I realized I was facing one of the children my father helped save, I was overcome with such emotion that for the rest of the ride I was unable to say a word. It never entered my mind that I might ask my driver for such mundane details as his name and how I could remain in touch. None of that. I simply basked in the confirmation of what I had always known. When this apparition dropped me off, he disappeared out of my life like some mirage in the shimmering desert heat. I haven't met a child, such a child since. I mean, I'm longing to meet those children he helped, and I haven't. I met him before I knew anything about it. That's the irony. My father was alive at that time still, and would be for the next 16 years, but I never thought to question him directly about precisely how his life and that of this young man intersected. Talking about his past was difficult for him, I knew, as for most survivors. Rabbi Gottlieb's oral deposition to Yad Vashem, Jerusalem, March 29 and April 30, 1977, we're jumping now to 1977, came into my hands for the first time in the 90s through Evelyn, ADUNKA, who kindly sent it to me thinking it might be of interest. That was 10 years after my father's death. Skimming through the pages, I learned that he had been in the field of Jewish education. With his help, a few people had managed to get out before the full force of genocide was imposed, and that was all. I thought I had more of a command of German at that time, 1977. I didn't. I didn't understand what I was reading. My knowledge was based on a slight acquaintance with Yiddish and from reading German poetry, Eine, Goethe, Schiller, together with my father during our long Scottish summer evenings at the seaside over the school holidays. So that was my only knowledge of German, was poetry. I found it easier than the long prose sentences. Forget it. Yeah, but poetry was beautiful. I let another 20 years go by. Many others, however, including the interviewer, my father's interviewer, who jolly well, he did know German, Viennese German, but he just didn't seem to understand my father at all. They were talking at cross purposes, so he interviewed him, and I don't think he understood what my father was about. So on that deeper level, he didn't get it. So he missed what he was saying. In Rabbi Gottlieb's testimony, this is another reason why one wouldn't understand what my father was saying. Rabbi Gottlieb himself, my father himself, describes what he did in such a muted and damped down fashion that it sounds almost boring. Like the true Englishman he had become, he tended toward understatement. An example of this is his habit of not taking credit to himself, but ascribing it to the teamwork, to the team of those with whom he interacted, pupils and younger colleagues. There's a saying of the early rabbis whom he loved so much to this effect: from interacting mikol milamdai hiskalti. What that means is, from interacting with my students, it is the one who professes to be a teacher who has gained wisdom. That's what it means according to my father, according to rabbinic interpretation. The Hebrew itself says, from all my teachers I have gained deepened wisdom. But Melamdai plays on student teachers. So the real teachers are the students. That's nice. So, yeah. To his approach, that was fundamental. In his deposition, the royal we is used not as a statement of authority to project distance, but as a mark of inclusiveness, with the pretense of serving only as a facilitator for bringing out ideas that are already in the air. This is a very Jewish as well as a socialist and a contemporary notion. That you don't really, the idea's there and then you help to elicit it. That's education. But the teacher does do something, does lead somewhere. One of the anomalies of Holocaust history is that many people have staked a claim to having been a lifesaver. For one Jew who got out, many legitimately could, and certainly have, taken credit for saving his or her life. My father did not read it that way. No great development appears out of the blue or is the achievement of a single person. There is a Hasidic notion that tikkun ha'alam, or redemption, on the plane of history, will come only through a long chain of individual acts of kindness. Behind the saving of one life, there's a long chain of anonymous good deeds. It was a time, he says in the deposition, when countless individuals were doing their utmost to save lives. In comparison with what they gave, he may have considered his contribution quite minor. He linked his effort to the chain of attempts to do the best possible. Historians have tended to gloss over it completely, possibly because he did. What is modesty in the protagonist may be construed as misjudgment by his interviewer. As a result of this and the language difficulty, at the time I again missed the point, until belatedly clearing out his Jerusalem apartment about 2 years ago, I came across another copy of the transcript. Closer reading on the plane ride home revealed what I had never known about his past. Indeed, what is known to very few people. And a subsequent professional translation, I got it about 3 weeks ago, disclosed even more. So my knowledge, I believe that one gets the knowledge when one's ready for it. So so when I got it, and I'm still getting it. I hope.
You all hope.
Yes, right. In the early days of the Anschluss, faced with his students' frustration, he was a teacher, at the obstacles in the way of their future, never mind any education, Rabbi Gottlieb came up with the idea of starting a radically new kind of school, at least for Vienna. It would be religious, because he was, and it would specialize in preparation for Aliyah, for going to Israel, or Palestine, whatever. Permission to open such an institution might even be forthcoming from the new Nazi regime, Eichmann. And in that way, a route out, an escape route for his students, would hopefully be guaranteed. In his deposition, Rabbi Gottlieb says, somehow we learned, I don't know exactly where this information came from, but there was a possibility that permission to have a youth Aliyah school could be obtained, or at least that it stood a chance. And this is how people negotiate when they know it's warm on the other end. It's an enemy, but you know that it's a possibility. There's something. Adolf Eichmann was sent to Vienna in those early days of the Anschluss. He was given one mission, to force as many Jews as possible out of Austria. In his reports back to Berlin, he needed to inflate the numbers. He needed numbers very fast. This was a production belt, or a destruction belt. the proposal that came to him from my father to Joseph Lowenherz, the new head of the Jewish community, my father's immediate superior, and from Lowenherz via Rabbi Benjamin Marmelstein, who broached the subject to Eichmann directly at the very beginning of Eichmann's career to open a school focused on that very goal of immigration, forced immigration for him, must have arrived as, I'm sorry for using the term, a godsend. It was good for him. Yet, while the Nazis used forced immigration as a means for decimating the Jewish community, the motivation, I've said this before, but the motivation behind my father's proposal was for the Jewish community's rejuvenation in its own country. The religious desire and objective that has been present in the daily Jewish prayers for 2,000 years and in the prophets and in the Bible, and which was Rabbi Gottlieb's personal goal, irrespective of Nazi persecution. What in German has a negative connotation, Auswanderung, connotation of exile, in Hebrew denotes some kind of promotion and elevation and rise of the soul, going higher to God's country. Kibbutz Galiot, it's ingathering, it's not exile, it's ingathering of the exiles. According to the whispered accounts that got back to my father, Rabbi Marmelstein stuttered when he made the request which he and the entire Jewish community wanted so much for their children. Eichmann replied with brutal sarcasm, "Herr Marmelstein, stop mumbling, and speak up." Nevertheless, despite the latter's nerves, Rabbi Gottlieb's proposal was approved, and his name came up and his qualifications as director of the project. One almost hears a palpable sigh of relief when Rabbi Gottlieb in 1977 says that he had no direct dealings with Eichmann, or Marmelstein for that matter. This was the kind of limelight that he could do without. He didn't like the limelight. That was his problem, my father. But it was he who had the brainwave of starting the institution, Jugendalijahschule, in Vienna, that was continued with increasing difficulty by a figure with whom my audience might be more familiar, Aaron Menzer. More later about this inspirational young man. Just wonderful. Yeah. At that time, Rabbi Gottlieb concedes, I founded, finally came out with an I founded the religious youth Aliyah school with the help of others, mostly young, mostly the youth. People are in love with youth. He was. Both were young and both were Zionist enthusiasts, both Menzer and he, aflame with idealism to go to Israel. There was a small age gap of 6 or 7 years between the two men. My father was 27 when he became the spiritual leader of the entire religious Zionist youth movement, Hashomer Hadati, in 1937. And Menzer began his association with Youth Aliyah, a non-sectarian, not particularly religious movement for emigration to Palestine, in 1938, when he was 21. Only 21. People were young and active in those days. And he did work for my father's school at a time that maybe my father was still there. He did. His association with my father's school began in 1938, at the end of that year. A little about my father. Rabbi Dr. Wolf Gottlieb was born in Zborov or something. Stanislaw, called East Galicia at the time, on March the 10th, 1910, into a religious family of textile workers and diamond cutters, simple people, and was regarded as the spiritual intellectual, Eloi. Eloi is from the same word as Aliyah, means high, intellectual, of the family, devoting his days to Jewish learning and to playing the violin. When his violin teacher recommended that he devote more time to his music and make it his life's work, he gave it up completely, devoting himself to his Torah learning instead. But every evening at 6 o'clock, he would leave his Beit Midrash, he'd leave his place of study, yeshiva, and to go to play football with the boys on the street. Perhaps Jewish boys, maybe not, I don't know, the boys on the street. The family was part of a Jewish demographic of Galicianers that moved to Vienna rather than be absorbed into Poland in 1921. So it was already in 1921, when he was about 11 years old, that he came. So he was there a long time. I didn't know this. I just began to realize it was a long connection with Vienna. In Vienna, as in his Galician shtetl of Plancza Mala, he learned in yeshiva, never attending school, but preparing for his high school graduation through private tutors. His tutor in German was his sister, Annie, the favorite of all his siblings, his favorite, I believe, because of her love for literature, poetry, and the humanities. And because of her general intelligence, he loved her. With her he read Eine and Goethe and Schiller, and later some of that appreciation was passed on to me in the summer holidays, Scottish summer holidays. So my father studied at your lofty university without ever going to school. While sitting in on general secular lectures at the university, his base was the famous Israelitisch, could you pronounce it please?
Israelitische Theologische Lehranstalt.
Thanks. The Rabbis and Teachers Seminary that produced a wonderful blend of rabbis and teachers who combined scholarship in Torah, specifically halakha, Jewish law, together with strict Jewish observance, with an appreciation not only of literary aspects of the Bible, Talmudic Talmud, Gadata, Talmud story, Midrash, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, but also an openness to Chokhmah, the wisdom of the nations, the humanities, modern scientific modes of critical thought, and all that. A lot of syntheses of seeming opposites were going to produce an enlightenment that was both Jewish and universal. These Jewish students believed. That was their dream. Let's see what happened. Well, while opening himself to all these new ideas, he and his best friend in yeshiva, who later I discovered became a trustee of the first board of his school. They were from a rich family. This friend of his was from Diamonds. And they funded his school. You'll hear about it in a minute. They escaped from yeshiva together, and they made visits to 10 of the greatest rabbis in Poland, submitting to learn with, be examined by, and finally be ordained by them, get samicha, get the rabbinical certificates from the greatest rabbis of that time. Thus my father and his friend, Dr. Israel Weinstock, later professor of Midrash and Kabbalah at Mossad Harav Kook in Jerusalem, came away with 10 of the best smichot possible. But the story does not end there. I can't help telling it to you. I better keep hold of time, though, because I've got a lot to tell you. Okay. All right.
That's right.
The regular Talmidim, students of one of these great rabbis, were jealous of these strangers who came to their master and walked off with the prize. They did a little research to find out who they were and discovered they were students at the University of Vienna. In those religious circles, secular studies and Torah learning did not mix. The students told their scandalous discovery to their teacher, who wrote to my father to ask why he had deceived them. My father replied that he had not intended any deception. At the time, he had not been asked what studies he was pursuing apart from Torah, so he simply had not talked out of turn. You don't mention everything. But if the Rebbe felt uncomfortable with such an association, he would be disappointed, but would return the ordination, the smicha, the certificate. A letter came back thanking him for his offer, but it would not be necessary. It had been the Rebbe's pleasure to learn with such enthusiastic and knowledgeable young people, and in his opinion, they deserved to be ordained by the best. This rabbi, the greater you are, the less political you are, and the less petty. While pursuing general studies at the university with an emphasis on philosophy, for which Vienna, I think, was famous, he told us, my father did tell us, stories of how, like the Greeks, he and his friends would stroll through the Vienna streets, like Socrates and his disciples, discussing finer points of philosophy. But his speciality was in Oriental studies, particularly Ugaritic, which had become a university discipline only during the 30s. It's one of those ancient languages. I think Eichmann was interested in that language too somehow. Yeah, and it only opened up in the 30s. This is interesting, somehow. Yeah. Yeah. In 1937, Rabbi Gottlieb became, as I mentioned, the spiritual leader of the Zionist religious movement, Hashomer Hadati, which later went under the name of Bnei Akiva, and which then and now is closely connected to the Mizrahi movement. It's a moderate movement. Nevertheless, for him, internal Jewish politics were not the main thing. That's for my father. Though he was totally committed to religious Zionism, he also kept in contact with more extreme religious youth groups, such as Aguda, the Haredi. They were very religious, because he was very religious. He just was open. So people who were opposed to Zionism at the time, Aguda was, and he kept in touch with them because they were wonderful people. As he said in his deposition, the Nazis taught them to become Zionists. They weren't at the time, but then they became. Also, in 1937, at the earliest, he started his own school. It was called the Achva Vereut School, the Brotherhood and Friendship School, which combined Jewish learning with a contemporary pedagogical approach instilled by his own academic training. You see, even from the name, that he was good at friendship with young people. But the name goes back. I made a mistake, because I'm very romantic. As you hear, he married in 1937. The term, the expression, the phrase, Achva Vereut, comes from the Jewish liturgy, wedding liturgy. And I thought he called it as a secret code to his marriage. Then I discovered that was not the case, because I did research on Jewish synagogues at the time when they started, and I discovered that there was Landsmannschaft, or a small prayer house, a Beit Midrash, called Achva Vereut, which was started in 1901. So these premises were opened by some other group, and they prayed there and studied together. And my father probably opened his school in the same address. It had the same address, 59 Taberstrasse. And that was the first address, I'm jumping, of the Jugendalijahschule, of the youth aliyah school. So anyway, so the school he opened at the beginning, his first school, was there in this Brotherhood and Friendship School. After celebrating the first year graduation of this institution, he took advantage of the summer break to travel to Falticeni, Romania, to celebrate his marriage to my mother, Bracha, Betty, Rosen, daughter of one of the Gedolijahschule, one of the great rabbis of the generation, Rabbi Avraham Aryeh Rosen, the Falticeni Rav, to whom he'd been introduced to his daughter a few years before. And she was the sister, as you mentioned, Evelyn, sister of the future chief rabbi of Romania, Moses Rosen. And they came from a long line, which is supposed to go back, which has been, there's a family tree going back to Rashi, the great commentator, the greatest biblical commentator, going back to King David. It's David line. This is the messianic line. So she was something. So this independent and beautiful woman, she was, just wait, it gets better. had at first refused her consent to an arranged match. She didn't want one, although she was a rabbi's daughter. Later, she herself came to Vienna to study at the university, the first rabbi's daughter to do so. Her illustrious father may have been one of the Geborene, the great of his generation, but he received no payment whatsoever for his studies. And in addition to her studies, Betty taught English to film stars, a private tutor, to film stars like Elizabeth Bergner, who also came from Galicia. And she taught, and she sent most of the money she earned, she sent back home to support her starving parents. And she kept only a little for herself, which she spent mainly on cultural events. She didn't buy clothes, and she didn't eat. In fact, she had a condition of anemia since that time. But my father, in the university, they met again. And over the chicken he came from quite a well-off family, and they shared his chicken sandwiches. That's how they fell in love, directly, not through introduction, a few years after. And so she had something to eat as well, and then they got married. So this is, so as a niece, now I spoke recently, about a year ago, to a cousin of mine, apparently, who was 94 years old. I've never been in touch with her. She's in an assisted living facility in Los Angeles. And she was on the death march. She was in Auschwitz. But we talked. I said, do you remember my father and my mother? So she is very clear. Over the telephone from New York to Los Angeles. So she said, he was in the marriage, he was considered the lucky one and regarded as having married up. Didn't matter that she had no dowry whatsoever, no money. But he was the lucky one because he got her. And I said, oh, why? It must have been because she was the daughter of one of the greatest rabbis, this link messianic chain. And she said, oh no, because she was, and I interrupted because I tend to, sometimes I did that. So I said, oh, because she was very beautiful, because I knew she was. I had pictures of what she looked like at that time. And it was out of this world. She won a national beauty competition. And actually, she was, I don't know, so she defended my grandfather's Talmud. All his books were confiscated by anti-Semites, denounced them, and they were confiscated by the state, by Romania. She had to go to the king and the queen, and to the royal court, and beg them to give back the Talmud. And the crown prince saw her. And he proposed to her. He was always proposed. He had a Jewish mistress. Anyway, she said she told him she couldn't marry. She couldn't marry out. And he said, oh, don't worry, it's just going to be a morganatic marriage. I just want to give you land. I want to give you land and horses and a beautiful life. You're wonderful. I just want to be you be my lady. That's what he said. That's what she told me. It's like a story. But I wouldn't believe it. I mean, it's just so out of this world, except I saw pictures. And she looked like more beautiful than Elizabeth Bergner in that style. Yeah. Not when I knew her. She was nothing like that, I have to say. I mean, I'm just telling you the truth. But these were the pictures from then. I think she suffered a lot. Anyway, so this is a total distraction, but it's not deviation. So they got married, and Rabbi Gottlieb took his new bride back with him to Vienna, and where she had been a student. And 6 months later, into their honeymoon year, honeymoon's a year in Jewish marriage. On March 12th, 1938. It was March 12 and March 13. March 12 was Shabbat. That was Shabbat Zachar, the Shabbat of remembrance of another genocide, just before Purim. It was remember what they did to you. I'm sorry. Okay, you're all into remembrance. Right. But in the Jewish calendar, this is followed by Pesach. I'm just bringing this in. The festival of Jewish national freedom. That was April 16 to 23rd in 1938. But there was no national freedom for the Jews at that time. It was Anschluss time. The school did not, I'm quoting now from the deposition. The school did not open to great fanfare. Now, Rabbi Gottlieb's deposition, nothing dramatic happened. He wasn't into drama. Right. Dr. Rosenkrantz, who was his interviewer, Herbert Rosenkrantz, I've changed subject completely. How do you explain, with the interviewer, and you'll see what he was like, how do you then explain that the Zionist review, the Zionistische Rundschau, as far as I remember, barely mentions your Jugendalijahschule school, nor the graduation celebration, while other minor events were written up in great detail? Dr. Gottlieb, I am not responsible for newspapers or any kind of party politics. How do I know why they didn't write me up? I'm not interested to know. I did know that the Zionist Review existed, but I never read it. It wasn't like the Jewish Chronicle that everyone reads. It wasn't your daily paper. It wasn't the Times. Not everyone read it. I have to just tell you, during his lifetime career in Glasgow, Rabbi Gottlieb had his fill of gossip-mongering journalists. I'm a journalist, sorry. But I try not to do gossip, I try not. In Eichmann's letters back to his old friend, Hagen, in Berlin, with whom he had gone to Israel, Palestine, he confides he has adopted the Rundschau, the Zionistische Rundschau, as his newspaper. It was his. And that was hardly a recommendation. Well, he adopted the community, he adopted everybody. So, at the time. In the deposition itself, my father has very little bad to say of anybody. That's about the worst comment he says in the whole of his deposition is about the Zionistische Rundschau, and that he doesn't like, he doesn't like journalists. Well, when grilled by his interviewer about leaders such as Alois Rothenberg, I'm sorry, I'm going into a bit of politics in the Jewish community, because wherever there's life, there's politics. Well, I'm sorry, and wherever there's Jews, there's also politics, because we are a very talkative people and differ and have little differences, which we build up too much. Yeah. So when grilled by his interviewer about leaders such as Alois Rothenberg of the Palestine office and Lowenherz of the IKG, of the community, and how they were regarded by the grassroots of the Jewish street, in the interview, Dr. Gottlieb staved off speaking ill of people who were in a responsible and totally unenviable position. Dr. R, in this context, I would like to ask you a provocative question. Tropper, I actually worked for American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in New York, but it had a European joint, and the head of that, Morris Tropper, wrote in December 1938 that Lowenherz and Rothenberg were Gestapo agents. He wrote it privately. He called them as bad as that. He blackened them. That's slander, basically. And he didn't intend that to be read by Scott, even by me. But this, for history already, the interviewer is trying to get at the real characters of these men, because they were dealing with the Nazi authorities in between. What was your attitude toward the leading functionaries of the Jewish community? What did the Jewish majority, the Jüdische Gasse, think in those days? How do you see these things today in 1977 when you know what went on? All the different politics. Dr. G, some people are naturally paranoid. We know for certain now that there have always been collaborators in Poland. That's Jewish collaborators, I'm afraid, as well. Today, we know exactly how this developed, that even decent people gradually were pressured into becoming a Moser, an informer. This is a sad fact in general, but the leaders of the Zionist movement in Vienna, Rothenberg of the Agency for Palestine, and Lowenherz of the Jewish community were generally trusted. Nobody seriously suspected them of being Gestapo agents. Most of us understood that pressure was exerted on these men, and as much as one Jew trusts another, then and always we trusted them. I don't believe that agents were a common phenomenon. What reasons this proper had for such a statement is a separate matter. But don't get me to talk gossip about people I respected so very much, who are doing day and night, trying to do the best for the community. The trouble is, when you work politically at all, when you're working for the Jewish community en masse, it's bound to be that the individuals who don't get in, who somehow feel that they have not been treated right, if they survive another way, they're going to blacken the names of those. If politics brings bitterness from people who are out of the net, if you work for, and that's terrible. It's just, it goes with being a very responsible person and not just thinking of yourself and your friend. I don't like politics too much. I'd rather be an individual, but that's selfish, Similarly, when asked about personalities such as Moritz Pappenheim and Julian Steinfeld, he had only good things to say about the generosity showed by countless wealthy Jews to their more impoverished co-religionists. They gave money and money and money to get people out. In response to this fishing, the immigration, the whole emigration was funded by Jews. It wasn't funded by Britain. It wasn't funded by anybody else, other countries. It was funded by Jews. In response to this fishing expedition on the part of his interviewer, Dr. Gottlieb's eloquent reserve shines forth as a kind of moral nobility. Aspersions based on unfounded suspicions and jealousies in Judaism falls into the category of slander, lashon hara. As soon as Rabbi Gottlieb received word from the higher-ups in the community that his proposal had been approved, everybody, meaning he, simply got down to work. At the outset, he had the pleasant task of selecting the best possible staff, and he had la crème de la crème to choose from. All the most brilliant Jewish professors and teachers from the secular and the Jewish educational system had been fired. He could hire the best. They needed bread to eat. They needed to give, to teach. He could hire, Classes immediately moved from their Taberstrasse address into accommodation in the Tempelgasse, with enough space for the mounting number of students who applied. Later, the school was expanded to other locations. The Krugerheim, previously a school for girls only in Malzgasse 7, and the buildings of the Palästinensamt in Mark-Aureli-Strasse 5, number 5, almost in the same building as the Gestapo. It's around there. The building in these school buildings, the very same buildings, were later, after my father's time, converted into fearsome assembly points for deportation. Just as I think the shul itself, the main synagogue, was also. But the heart of the Jewish people was taken for deportation. Firstly, directly after the Anschluss, the Jugendalijahschule school was the only Jewish institution of its kind known to Rabbi Gottlieb that was open and operating in the country. The non-religious apparently didn't have anything like it, the secular. Then after many months the school existed, two young men from the main branch of the Jewish community, Yehuda Weisbrod and George Uberal, later Ehud Avril in the Israeli government, who was a very young man at the time, came to us, this is reading from the deposition, to look at our curricula and discuss them. They discussed all the curricula because they wanted to start a youth aliyah school for non-religious, and why not? But it never got off the ground. And I can only guess it's because it's a few months later.
It did.
It did?
Yes, there was the Marco they were all...
Which one?
From the Mentor, this is the book about the book.
Oh, no. Mentor was the same one as my father's.
But he was a success.
There was a center, and they were the religious in different groups. And there was the Shomer HaTzair, and there was the Mizrahi, and the
Yes.
Yehuda, and they were all together in the Marco-Strasse.
Yes.
On different
In the
hours.
which Strasse?
Marco-Strasse.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
What I showed you.
Right. So the groups were together, but as a school it wasn't.
No, they had...
It was a sort of school.
There were also teachers there.
Yeah.
They had different classes.
Andra Menser, probably. He would take in Menser would take in everybody at that time. It had to.
Maybe it was not
Not at the time my father did it. It wasn't a youth aliyah.
It was later.
It was later. It did. Later.
Yes.
Menser did it. He brought it all together. But at that time, yeah. Okay, so we're both satisfied. So it did. It happened, but later.
No, because it was in the interest of the Nazis.
Oh, of course.
They supported it.
So right, so I should suppose whatever that it was because the Nazis didn't want to anymore, but because of timing, they did want to, and they still did it.
At that time.
Yes, it's a matter of time, and so it happened after my father left. Okay. The daily schedule in Rabbi Gottlieb's school was divided into two parts. Theoretical subjects, the field of religion and culture, Bible, Hebrew grammar, Jewish and Zionist history, were held in the mornings. And my father taught Talmud and Agadata, story from the Talmud. And in the afternoon, they applied themselves, the students, to practical training in various trades. In very hard labor, so that they should be acclimatized to take any job going. Not that Jews are always intellectual, but they could do hard labor, hard work when they get to Israel, and agricultural work. So there's hakshara, little farms, little model kibbutzim also at that time. Yeah. But everything was geared to Aliyah. Yeah. As for my father, in the afternoon, he spent his time... Whoops. Yes, but please. So, later questions, but I'm here. Yeah. Anyway, he himself fulfilled a double function. In the afternoon, he opened a special office in the Praterstrasse to register students, and they were all lining up and queued because they more and more saw this as a safe haven, a place where Jewish children could come, and the Nazi authorities did not come with their thugs as in the streets. If Jewish children were in the streets and couldn't go to school, they'd be attacked. But if they went to this school, okay. Preparation for emigration, out you go. So it was a safe place, and their parents wanted them to be there for many reasons. So it worked from the spring through the summer and the fall. Just paradoxically, just because it was the Anschluss and there was nowhere else that Jewish children could go to school, they spent more time. They took the classes more seriously. That was their education, and they could give them the best. It was like a university. It was with all their hearts. And my father said this was it was education as you don't know. When he started the other school, it was courses, just like cheder. They'd go to a secular school during the day, and the evening they'd drop in for a bit of Jewish studies. Now it was all day, and they did it in a much deeper way, and they loved it. It had depths to it. And they did general studies as well. As an example of what he meant, he said that he taught Talmud to a mixed group of about 60 boys and girls, which in itself was unprecedented. It says in the Talmud, don't teach your daughter Talmud. Don't teach that a Jewish law to your daughter. It's bad. It's a bad thing. So my father was revolutionary in this way, that boys and girls together would study this in a class of 60, where they were all feeling privileged that they were there learning together and paying attention, and that there was friendship, boys and girls. So it was a really big thing, he said, morally and factually, and also as far as education went. They really learned something. He sensed a certain impatience for such a small beginnings on the part of his secular interviewer. So he was put on the defense. I can feel he's on the defensive in the deposition, because it doesn't impress the interviewer, who's totally secular, and studying Torah is nothing, I'm afraid. In Scotland, my father was able to teach at the Queen's Park Cheder, it's evenings classes, and at Glasgow University, to priests and to ministers. And he would chair the rabbinical court. He became the head of the rabbinical court. And then he would attend royal garden parties at which he shook hands with the Queen, without being made to feel that any one of these activities was less or more important than any other. No snobism there. But Dr. Rosenkranz, I'm afraid this is politics, it's terrible, moves on to the subject with which he is most concerned. He's not interested at all in anything deeply Jewish. He wants to move on to the political side. And, so you prepared the children for Aliyah. I'm afraid I don't believe that his idea of Aliyah was the same as mine. His idea of Aliyah is the political going to the land of Israel. That kind of secular Zion. My idea of Aliyah is the depths of a dream and of something spiritual, and living the best in the best way morally as well. It's all in the land, in the Holy Land. It's a different idea. I shouldn't say but anyway, he didn't get my father at all. The school started within certain parameters. It was made clear, I'm afraid it was political, it had to fulfill certain, that eligible students had to commit themselves to living in a religious environment, such as a kibbutz in Palestine, for at least 2 years. With the acceleration of Nazi persecution, however, Rabbi Gottlieb's office was flooded with overwrought parents and children from all sectors of the community, secular and assimilated on the one hand, communist, and religious non-Zionists, the Aguda and more Haredi, on the other, at that time, before Mensa, right? In view of the worsening external circumstances, according to my father's deposition, Youth Aliyah was persuaded to overlook parents' political affiliations and the children's physical readiness for kibbutz life, as long as all the children lived within the frame of their promise. That's 2 years they had to be there in a religious environment. I was told 2 different things by Gabriella Underham. Said that the Youth Aliyah was very rigorous indeed in its choice of children. This is not my father, it was Youth Aliyah. They were strict about age, and they were strict about health. You had to be extremely healthy. And they were strict about, and the other thing was that many religious children found themselves, when they got to Israel through Youth Aliyah, they found themselves in a totally secular environment. They were not given that religious framework they were promised. And they were totally out of, upset, and wrote letters. They wanted to come back to Vienna. Yeah. Anyway, so whether they were religious, but my father didn't know this. He didn't know anything what was going on at the Palestine end, the Israel end. Whether they were religious or not, nobody asked about that, he said. In this circumstance, with all the danger. Within our framework, he meant his, not Youth Aliyah. They had to be religious. but the strictures Rabbi Gottlieb made later in life in his position of Beis Din. I'm going to tell you something hard which he had to face. Head of the Rabbinical Court of Scotland, as to the essential halachic legal qualifications for being a Jew. He believed in those qualifications for being a Jew, but only in the circumstance of where it's all right, where life is okay. For being a Jew were not applied to the selection of children for his school. He said, we didn't play politics. We accepted every Jewish child. And I might as well tell you that children from mixed marriages who, from a technical or halachic point of view, weren't even Jews, that's from his point of view, if the mother wasn't Jewish, they too were accepted. With us, that wasn't a factor. A Jewish child, that means every child who is threatened by their connection with the Jewish people in any way, because the father, because of one side or one grandparent, if they had any type of threat from the Nazis, they could come to his school and be safe. Nothing. No. He tried to loosen up all the because it was a rescue mission. The life of human beings comes first. Not everyone has to be Jewish, but if they're threatened as Jews by the Nazis, they get into the school. So that was how he looked at it. Dr. Rosenkrantz changed the subject. He didn't find it interesting. He wanted to know exactly when Rabbi Gottlieb started the school. Approximately 40 years. Ooh, what's the time?
Yeah, no. A little bit more.
Yeah, but all right. So he wanted to know when he started the school. So there's a difficulty there. See, my father told them that he'd been given courses, and that he started before or just after the Anschluss. He'd already been given courses, and after the Anschluss, he started the school. He said before or after Pesach. So Pesach ended on the 23rd of April that year. So Dr. Rosenkrantz, who seems very polite, he just said, do you mean that you started the school when all the Jewish institutions were closed and the Jewish community was closed, and you started your school then? He's very derisive. And he said, very mocking. Now my father, it's 40 years later, he couldn't remember the exact date. He knew that he started, he said after Pesach, immediately. Immediately. This probably means because he worked for the Jewish community, it opened on the 3rd of May, and he probably started with them because he was working for the Jewish community. It was a link up between the community, Jugendalijahschule and Nazis. Yeah, so that's, but Dr. Rosenkrantz was questioning it. And when Dr. Rosenkrantz came out with his big book, his big history, he did grudgingly give my father about 2 lines in his history. He said, well, yes, Rabbi Wolf Gottlieb he was the principal of this school, from July 1938 till October 1938. When I read that, I was shocked because it doesn't give him much time, and I wanted him, to have a bit more glory.
Later on, I will say something, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Anyway, and I think the reason for this, I'm going to go quickly because I think the reason for this was because Dr. Rosenkrantz he was not trying to distort it. In fact, my father started the school maybe in 1937. That's why he sent into Yad Vashem after the interview. He was disturbed by the interview. He sent in a clipping about the graduation of his school in 1937. The Achva, the Reut school, the Brotherhood and Friendship in Taborstrasse 59. And that was also the Jugendalijahschule school. It was the same school for him. But he also at the beginning of the Anschluss, he also made this negotiation through Marmelstein as soon as Eichmann came, and they were talking already about Youth Aliyah and about the emigration. According to the documents that Rosenkranz had, and he became the head of one of the top people at Yad Vashem. He had a lot of paperwork, like a jigsaw puzzle, from Youth Aliyah. The documentation of working together with Youth Aliyah started only in July. So, from Rosenkranz's point of view, the saving of Jews was in July. From my father's point of view, he started the school in the Anschluss. And all the children. So at one point, Rosenkranz he almost begins to cry. He said, how could we have given you the hope of getting children out from Youth Aliyah when we had no money for children at all? Where did you hear that you should take in children from 12 to 4? My father got the instruction from someone in Youth Aliyah that 12 to 14. And he didn't keep to the rules. He was a man of rules, my father, of law, but he stretched it. 11 to 15. He couldn't stretch it further. He took children in at both ends. The reality of the Yishuv in Israel, Yishuv means the settlement, the beginning of Israel, was they were starving. They had no money. They were bankrupt. They were living on tomatoes and had physical effects of that. And what they wanted for the Youth Aliyah was to get even wealthy Jews from Europe, young people who are idealists, to come give cheap labor on the land. They weren't a charity project for young children. There were 2 orphanages in Israel which were full to overflowing. And they took some children and put them there from my father's school, but they didn't have, he said, how could we give you such hope? But he spoke in 1977 to my father. And the truth is that due to that hope, my father was able to start this school, and the Nazis were open to it because they thought there was place for the children. There was not at that time. So all the spring and the summer, they worked, the children, and they grew, and there was more and more of a school. And all the children, and even they graduated in Chol HaMoed Sukkot, which was about the middle of October. And in the graduation, my father was giving a talk all about the center, how Israel and Zion is the center of our lives, to hundreds of young graduates. And the Nazis were surrounding all the place where he was speaking, which was the Polnische Schule on Leopoldstrasse. This was they celebrated it by davening Mincha, the afternoon service. This was the last service in the Polish Schule because it was close to Kristallnacht. It was destroyed totally. This was the last. And every minute my father spoke, he expected to be arrested. But he wasn't. And the children, nothing was disturbed, and they listened, and they understood. And he said, they kind of liked what he was saying, those people, because there was emigration. And all the children got out. All these graduates. Kristallnacht had 1 or 2 good effects, unfortunately. One was that when Youth Aliyah knew what had happened, all their strictures, which were so very rigorous, and even their ideal of building up the land, were overthrown. All they wanted was to save the Jewish children. And they started a transport. And these people, the school was closed. It seems from my father's deposition that it was really, everything was in shambles after Kristallnacht. And there was certainly no public daven in a religion, in private places, but not in the big synagogues. And the school was on break. it seemed that I don't know where he got his dates, Rosencrantz, that my father ended at that time, but in October. I don't think he did. But everything was cut off, all Jewish public life. But nevertheless, all the children, their names were on Youth Aliyah, were on the list, and they got out with children transport through my father, and emigration was working double time. And also the governments, even Britain, which had shut off to all connection with Israel, it started to be very difficult to get to Israel. And they opened kinder transport. So the last children, who were the youngest, who were refused anyway by Youth Aliyah because they didn't want, they also got out to England. So when it came that my father had to choose which exit visa he took, he wanted to follow these young children. He wanted to be with them and to be close to their lives. So it was not so, he wasn't so rigid about his life's dream, which was hijacked in the process. His life's dream was to go on Aliyah to Israel. But he thought, I have a living connection with these children. It's good that I go to England.
Let's separately discuss.
We should discuss.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I have a very moving follow-up, which is the most moving of a lot, but okay.
So he was...
Pardon?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just read you the very last paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
See, my whole take on this is that the deposition is very upbeat. It's a very optimistic, and I don't like American optimism. I don't like shallow optimism, when there's such a shadow to come. And he was very lucky to get out. But I do like it in his deposition, because I know that he himself, how much he suffered. Sorry, I'm glad he suffered. And he was arrested, he was beaten up during that time. It doesn't enter the deposition. All his family were killed. And also Annie, his favorite sister, and their children, and his father and mother were gassed immediately. He was arrested immediately on the 27th on the 27th of October, after the graduation, as soon as the semester was over, the term of the school, because of the pollen axiom. But anyway, finally he got to England, and he wrote a little book on, I'm just going to say that in Scotland he would sing. I would hear him humming when he would go to shul. He would hum a tune. He was very light, very, very. But I once came into his study. I knocked, but then I came right in, and I looked at him, and he was totally different from what I've ever seen. It was as if there was a dark cloud all over the room. And I couldn't understand. It was like a nightmare. And I saw that he looked up at me, and I wasn't supposed to be there, and he was crying. So in his hand was an exercise book from childhood, and it was poetry. It was Schiller, Heine, where he copied out some poem, a German poem, into that book when he was a child. And also on it was a flower, because in those days his sister, he said, had pressed that flower, Annie, had pressed that flower into his copybook. Yeah. And he didn't know, there was a living flower. It disintegrated as he opened this book. So it was his sister who was killed, gassed there. So he used to go. Now this is the end. This is how it goes. He used to sing a Hasidic melody when he was going to synagogue, and I didn't know what it was, but I would hear in it this wonderful Hasidic thing of joy and sadness, and the words went like this. When I just a second, right. Very oh God. Yeah. Sorry. All right. All right. When the Holy One, blessed be He, when the Holy One, blessed be He, sees the Jewish people studying the Torah, he has a certain reaction. When God, he turns to his heavenly host and he says, look down there, what they're doing. These are my children, my beloved children. They're studying the Torah. They are immersed when they're suffering. They don't focus on their own suffering, and it's unbearable, but they're sharing with my joy. They're able to go up to my joy. Oh, how I love my children, my children. And this comes directly from Rabbi Akiva, who said that all mankind, all men are made in the image of God, and all men are beloved because they are made in the image of God. However, the children of Israel are God's children because they know from the Torah that they're made in God's image. And they know how to live. They have a law of how to live, if they live it that way, which is tough. And if they do, then they are raised up, and in this suffering, they still have this joy. But it's very hard to hold on to.
So, wir haben jetzt noch ein bisschen... Bitte?
I knew your father.
What?
I knew your father.
When?
Years ago in Glasgow.
Oh, uh-huh. You're from Glasgow?
I went to Queen's Park Cheder.
Right, so there's Cheder, Queen's Park Cheder. I just hoped someone would come who was a child, but you're a child, you went to the Cheder. There you are.
How many Jews are in Glasgow now?
Pardon?
How many Jews are in Glasgow?
I don't know numbers. I'm not very good at numbers. This is me. I'm not German in this way. My father would know more of reality. I don't know statistics.
But you had how many synagogues? You had one synagogue or...
Synagogues closed down. There were about 6 or 8 at the time I grew up. They're less and less now.
Yes.
Everyone goes to Israel or to America, or here you are.
Yeah, Queen's Park doesn't exist now.
No, I was very sad to see.
And I've been to members of Netherley and Parkston.
What?
Netherley and Parkston.
Those are
and that's also not there.
There's a Scottish accent.
Yes.
Yeah.
I get my Scottish accent when I speak to Scots enough.
And
You've got a Hutchie accent.
I've got what?
Hutchie accent.
Oh, good. Yes, Hutchie is Hutchison's Girls' Grammar School. That's a very elevated school, for all Scottish young ladies.
Right. And you have this English accent.
Yeah, that was my Cambridge days.
Cambridge. Wow.
Yes, what was I going? Yeah. Oh, my father, I forgot to. He climbed out of a window.
When?
Where?
We're in Girton. You're not allowed, men were not allowed in my days when I was in Girton. They were not allowed in college when it was dark. And he came to give a shiur, a lecture, to a group of young Jewish men who, and women, and everyone was climbing out of the window, but he climbed out of the window with them and was caught by the bulldogs. Bulldogs were not dogs. They were special men with canes and with black gowns who would make sure that there were no men in the college after 10 o'clock at night. And there was Rabbi Gottlieb in the dark. So he was a bit like a boy. He was youthful. He was not dragged down by his memory. His memories were not as bad as later.
Where did you spend your holidays?
What?
You mentioned that you spent your summer somewhere.
Prestwick and Ayr.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, Rabbi Burns.
Yeah.
And Yeah, but we went for a month, and he would spend Shabbat together with the community, and another day. Then he would come for a few days, a holiday, and then back again. So we had long family holidays.
Discuss it inside.
Okay, right.
One more for all.
Yes, please.
Please, can you tell us, please, a little bit more about the last days of your father in Vienna and about the circumstances of his escape? Yeah, how could he manage it? Where did he get the permit? Where did he go to first time in Britain and so on?
How did he manage it? Well, he got, I think working for the community, he got 2 exit visas, one for Israel and one for and one for America. And then his friend Israel Weinstock, with whom he escaped from yeshiva to go to the from university. He went from the university to the rabbis and back again, and did that grand tour, getting all these ordinations. His friend got out because he was very wealthy and managed to get out, and then the whole family guaranteed my father to come to England, and it was in his name. That's why he went there.
Okay, the Weinstock family, yeah?
The Weinstock, yeah, in London.
Okay, then it was...
Weinstock family in London.
Yes, and it was possible to do that.
Yeah.
But I saw the exit papers from the community. I saw them recently in the Center, what's his name? The History of the Jewish People, the Center for the History of the Jewish People. And they said he was without means completely. By the time he came, they took away everything. Now, he came from a wealthy family, I think even banking, I have to say. And I don't know a thing about it, but it was all stripped by the Nazis.